Okay, it's been a minute since I made a video about editing. I just wanted to make another one, so here we go. Okay, so here is a collection of images that I shot when I was second shooting for my friend Brandy Crockett. These are from a wedding that we shot in Ojai last October at a venue called Thatcher House, which is one of my absolute favorite venues. Dune and I have 2 weddings there this fall, which we're really excited about. Amazing wedding, beautiful day, just this beautiful collection of images here. Lots of different lighting scenarios from getting ready all the way to open dancing at the end of the day. So this is a good collection to show you sort of how I would edit these images. So my philosophy around editing is that I really want the images to not look like they've been edited, but I want them to feel elevated. For the past couple of years, I've been using profiles. The profiles that I've been using most recently are from Good Light Pack 4, the Eric McVeigh pack. I don't use the presets that are included in the pack. If there are presets, I just use the profiles. So just the profiles that are included in the pack. So this first image, I'm actually gonna make it black and white. So if we go into our profiles, here are the Good Light, Eric McVeigh, black and white profiles. So the one that I like is MB1, so we're going to apply that. And what I've been thinking about a lot with editing is looking at white balance, looking at contrast and exposure. So for me, this image looks fairly well exposed. It's just an interior shot of the groom putting a shoe on, right? This has too much contrast for my taste, so I'm going to bring up the black point. I might bring down the highlights slightly. I might bring up the shadows slightly. I'm going to bring the overall image up, overall exposure up. And I might just take the contrast slider and bring that down. That's a before, that's an after. So this already is looking pretty good. I keep the sharpening at default. I like adding some texture. So I'm going to add like maybe plus 20 texture, and I'm going to bring down the clarity to maybe minus 10. And then I'm going to add a little bit of grain. I don't love adding a ton of grain to digital images, but I do think that having some just sort of takes the edge off a little bit. So I'm just going to bring the grain slider up to about 25 and see what that does. So you just get this nice, slight, subtle texture. And then the last thing is this is a little bit too stark for me. It's like too cool maybe. So I'm gonna go into color grading and into the global settings, and I'm just gonna add some warmth here. I'm gonna find a hue that I like. 16 saturation is a little bit too high, so I'm gonna bring this down to like 8. So that's a before, after, before, after. And this would be finished for me, this black and white shot. So pretty cool. Here's a portrait of our bride. So Brandy brings this awesome drop that she sets up with C-stands, and it's a lot of work and effort and in time and intention to set this up, but it creates absolutely beautiful images. This one, obviously we're gonna crop, so I'm gonna press the keyboard shortcut R, and I'm gonna keep the same aspect ratio and just crop in until we don't see any of that background. As you might notice, this is an RAF file. This was shot on the Fujifilm GFX 102. The files are absolutely amazing. I don't own this camera anymore. I actually sold it just because it ultimately didn't fit in with my workflow, but I did shoot it this day, so we have several examples that were shot on the GFX, and they're just amazing digital images. I mean, just like endless amount of detail in these files. It's really beautiful. So for this, let's cycle through our profiles and see which one we like. I'm going to keep this one in color. So here's the Good Light presets, pack 4, Eric McVeigh. M1 and M2 are good. I also like M4 and I also like M8. Let's try M4 for this one. So you can see right off the bat, I mean, this profile, it's too heavy-handed, but we're going to fix that with our various adjustments here. So in the basic panel, I might just bring down the overall intensity of the profile to about 70% for this image. It's a little dark, so I'm going to bring up the overall exposure. I'm going to bring down the contrast slider just because it's a little bit too contrasty for me. I'm going to bring up the blacks and the shadows. I'm going to bring down the highlights slightly. I might bring up the whites slightly. Bring down the overall exposure again. It's looking a little bit too green for me, so I might add some magenta in the tint. Let's do a before and an after, before, after. We missed a little bit on the cropping, so I'm just going to crop in even further. There we go. I might further crop in. Let's see what that looks like. There we go, that's looking pretty good. I'm going to add some texture like we did earlier. I'm going to drop our clarity. The detail section, I'll keep the sharpening at default. And I'm gonna add some grain. So again, I'll drag the grain up to about 25. That is actually too much grain for me. I'm gonna bring it back down to maybe around 15, maybe 10. Let's see. Yeah, just a little bit of texture. And that is a finished photo for me. Beautiful. Before, after, before, after. Okay, here's another image. This is right after their first look. This photo was shot on the R5 with the 50mm f1.2. I shot this at f2, and I'm gonna just apply our settings from our previous image. So obviously that applied the crop, which we don't want. So I'm gonna press R and reset that crop. Looks okay, it's very green. So we're gonna go ahead and reset the white balance. That looks better already. I'm just gonna try auto white balance to see what it does. It's a little bit too magenta, so I'll bring back some green. I think that overall this image is a little bit overexposed with the settings we just copied, so I'm gonna bring down the exposure. That's already looking better, and it's a little bit too cool for me, so I'm gonna go ahead and warm this up. I'm gonna bring our highlights back up and bring our whites up slightly. This is looking really good. It does have a little bit too much contrast for me, so I'm gonna go ahead and bring down the contrast slider, and I'm gonna bring up the blacks. That's looking better. I'm gonna bring down the overall exposure, playing again with magenta, adding a little bit of warmth, before, after, before, after. This looks pretty good to me. We have our texture settings, we have our grain settings from the previous image. If we zoom in, lots of detail here. Really beautiful files from the R5 and the 50mm. That's another combination that I just really love. So I'm gonna go ahead and copy all of these settings. Whenever I copy settings, I copy everything, usually except for transform, crop, remove, and masking, because those are pretty individualized. Sometimes I'll also leave out white balance and exposure, but for the purposes of this gallery right now, I'm gonna copy everything, including white balance and exposure, excluding transform, remove, crop, and masking. That way we can paste our settings onto the next image. So this is a GFX file, and I mean, as you can see right out of the camera, this is really beautiful. It almost doesn't need anything at all. But I'm gonna go ahead and apply the settings and see what happens. Immediately we see the skin become much more magenta. So we're gonna bring that out of the tint, and we're gonna also reset the white balance here. I'm gonna bring up the overall exposure a little bit. I'm gonna bring down the blacks. Obviously this is looking very green right now. Let's apply auto white balance, see what happens. That looks much better. Before, after, before, after. It's a little bit too magenta, so I'm just gonna bring that down slightly. And it might overall be just a little bit too saturated. So what I'm gonna do is bring down the vibrance. I'm gonna just bring down the vibrance to -15. Before, after, before, after. And what this does is it just adds a really beautiful color to the image. It sort of refines the color, but it keeps it looking very natural, looking very much like what the image looked like straight out of the camera. So for me, this one is finished. I'm gonna go ahead and copy the settings from this image. I'm gonna move on to the next one. I'm gonna go ahead and paste my settings. This is a photo from the R5 with the 50mm 1.2. As you can see, again, it's beautiful straight out of camera. There's not really much that we have to do to these images. And the goal with editing is to really refine colors, correct anything that needs to be corrected, whether it be bringing exposure down, raising shadows, or correcting white balance, things like that. Any of this like over stylized editing is not something that I'm really going for, even though these edits are somewhat stylized since we're using these film profiles. I want them to be reminiscent of film, but I don't want to take away from the beautiful image that this digital camera is capturing. We apply the settings from the previous image. Here's what we have, and pretty much works right off the bat. That's a before, that's an after, before, after. I might just bring down the overall exposure. I might add a little bit of magenta and a little bit of warmth and play with some of these settings in the basic panel. Before, after, before, after. So just a little bit elevated, a little bit refined, but very, very close to the original image. Again, we're gonna just copy these settings, move on to the next image. All right, here we go, let's apply these settings. And again, right off the bat, this looks pretty good. I might bring up the overall exposure and bring down the highlights, bring down the blacks. This one could use a little bit more contrast, so I'm gonna bring back the contrast slider. I'm also gonna increase the warmth on this one, and that looks pretty beautiful. Before, after, before, after. All right, same idea. We're gonna go ahead and paste the settings onto this photo. This one is quite underexposed. This was shot on the GFX as well. We're gonna bring up the exposure, and I'm gonna go ahead and bring down the highlights, bring up the shadows, bring down the blacks. I'll bring down the overall exposure a bit. It's a little too warm, so I'm gonna bring down the warmth. Before, after, before, after. I'm just gonna reset the white balance. Okay, bring in more magenta, a little bit more warmth, higher exposure, before, after, before, after. All right, so this image was shot on the R5, this time with the 28-70 f2. So let's go ahead and apply the same settings, and automatically creates this just beautiful image. And just as a reminder, we're not doing a lot here with our editing. We're basically applying 70% of this M4 profile, which sort of gives us a base for the color. And then most of the tweaks are in the basic panel. Exposure, contrast, white balance, those are the three biggies. And so for this one, I might just bring down the overall exposure, bring down the blacks, but this looks pretty great as is. Before, after, before, after. Okay, we're gonna move on to this image. So this was also shot on the GFX. This is actually them as they were recessing after the ceremony. So lots of excitement. You can see people are throwing these petals in the air as they exit. Really beautiful moment. What a testament to this medium format camera that it's able to achieve focus on this couple as they're leaving their ceremony. And so you get this really beautiful image with lots of detail in focus, pretty amazing. So we're gonna just apply the settings to this photo. And again, it looks great. I'm gonna bring down the overall exposure. I'm gonna take out some of that magenta. I might bring back some contrast. Before, after, and that would be a finished image. We're gonna go ahead and apply those same settings to this one by clicking previous. Pretty much great right off the bat. We're gonna bring down the overall exposure, bring down the highlights, maybe add a little bit of magenta, maybe a little bit of warmth. Before, after, before, after. All right, the epic table setting. Let's go ahead and copy the settings from previous. It looks a little too magenta to me, so I'm gonna bring back that green. I'm gonna raise the exposure. I'm gonna bring down those highlights. I'm gonna add some contrast by bringing down the blacks. I bring down the exposure slightly. And I think I'm gonna bring down the white slightly. I'm gonna bring up the shadows slightly more. Let's see what that looks like. Before, after, before, after. It's looking a little too green to me. Bring back some magenta. Bring in some warmth. Before, after, before, after. This looks really great to me. I don't know if you can see, but there's somebody over here in the corner. So really cool thing about Lightroom now is we have access to generative AI remove, which is so amazing. So if you press Q, you can use this eraser to select the object you want to remove. So I'm just going to select him here, and we're going to let the AI remove him. And it did a really beautiful job. So here's our gorgeous table setting. Okay, here's a sort of late night slow shutter example. I shot this at 1 second exposure, handheld, and it's still relatively sharp. So you can see the table settings are mostly sharp, and then the people around it are blurry because they're moving, and this is sort of like a long exposure image. The GFX does have stabilization in the camera, so you're able to get up to 1 second handheld and get this kind of quality, which is really cool. So for this one, I'm gonna edit it to be black and white. So let's go into our profiles, MB1, and we're gonna take out some of the contrast. So we're just gonna raise the blacks and the shadows, and we're gonna bring down the whites, bring down the highlights, and then we're gonna raise the overall exposure. We're gonna add some texture. We're gonna take out some clarity. You see a pattern here. We're gonna add some grain. This was shot at ISO 400, so not tons of grain in it. And we're also going to add in some warmth the same way we did previously. So I'm just gonna find a hue that looks good, maybe at 12. Before, after, before, after. You can see what that warmth does. Then I'm gonna bring down the overall exposure. I think it's just a little bit too bright. Bring down the highlights even more. This looks really good to me. Here's a before, here's an after. And then I think we'll go ahead and we'll AI out this cell phone. It's just distracting me a little bit. So we're gonna take that out. We're also gonna take out this, I think it's a headphone case. We're gonna apply. Cell phones are just a part of wedding days now. They're all over the table, they're in people's hands, they're in people's faces. So it's just something we can sort of embrace, but also take out when we can. So here's what that did. So here's a before, here's an after. Awesome shot. We're gonna apply those same settings from the previous image to this one. So I'm just gonna actually copy the settings. Remember, this does not copy remove, so it won't copy any of those AI remove edits that we made. I'm gonna go ahead and paste those settings onto this image. And it makes a really, really beautiful black and white image. We're just gonna raise the overall exposure. This was shot on the GFX at f1.7, 1/125th of a second, ISO 6400. So that's pretty dark. This was a pretty dark image and it was originally exposed pretty dark. So this is a good example of the latitude in the GFX files, and they're really clean. We did add some grain, but we probably don't need to. So I'm gonna go ahead and take out the grain since there is some natural grain from the high ISO of 6400. So we're gonna remove any artificial grain. But this is what the image looks like. It's really clean. Really beautiful. Okay, so let's edit this image with a different profile. This one's kind of like late night. It has quite a bit of contrast to it, but it's also kind of dark, so it might be a little bit challenging. Let's go into our profiles and look at what we have. So here's what M2, M1, M4, they all look pretty bad. I like M8, it's a little bit more subtle, has a little bit more faded look to it. Obviously, this is late night, it's kind of a crazy image, but I love just the atmosphere and the party and the late night, the beautiful like fairy tale nature of this whole scene. Let's take the M8 profile down to 75%, sort of like a good starting place. We're gonna raise the exposure. We're gonna bring down these highlights, bring up the shadows. We're gonna bring up the blacks, bring down the overall exposure, bring up the blacks again, bring up the exposure. It looks pretty good. We're gonna bring down the warmth. It's just slightly too warm. And we're gonna make it a little bit more green, I think. Take out some more of that warmth. Before, after, before, after. I think it's a little bit too green and a little bit too bright. There we go. Before, after, before, after. Bring back some of the highlights and bring down the exposure. Great, it's looking a little too cool to me now, so I'm gonna just bring back some of that warmth. We're gonna add some more texture, bring down the clarity. And this was shot at 3200 ISO, so we're not gonna add any grain to this. That looks pretty good to me. Before, after, after. Okay, and this is the last image, so I'm gonna actually apply the settings from previous, which are not gonna really work very well, but we'll fix it. So obviously it makes it blue because of the white balance, but we're gonna reset that. And that looks pretty good to me right off the bat. I'm just gonna raise the overall exposure a little bit, and then we might crop into this. Before, after, before, after. There you go. Okay, just an overview of how I edit. I hope this was useful for you. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think about this style of editing, about this process. If you have anything to add, to teach me, or ask me, just be nice in the comments. Be nice. I'm just gonna say that here. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you're new here, consider subscribing to the channel. I'd love to see you at the next video. Thank you, as always, for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye.